it is to cultivate great relationships, especially in terms of those relationships that hit closest to home for us. Those things like parenthood, marriage, kids, and even just those close friendships in our lives. And so today I want to just kind of do a little groundwork and sort of lay the foundation for this series. And in fact, it literally actually entitled this message tonight, Fix the Foundation. Fix the foundation. Because the truth is, over these next several weeks, I could give you guys a bunch of great tips of how to improve communication between you and your spouse, or you and your kids, or you and your friends, or how to manage conflict, or how to grow intimacy and grow closer. But listen, if the foundation, if your relationship with Jesus is broken, it doesn't matter all that other stuff. In fact, truth is, the moment that it might, some of those great tips, some of those little classic kind of helpful hints and stuff, it might help create some change for a moment. But if the foundation is broken, man, none of that stuff's going to last. None of that stuff's going to make a lasting difference. And so today, what we're going to do to kind of unpack this and again to lay the groundwork for this series is we're going to look at the story of a guy by the name of Jacob. And we find Jacob's story in Genesis chapter 35. And so if you have a Bible, I encourage you to follow along. Otherwise, you can follow along on the screens. But Jacob, I find this story actually really encouraging because, I think if you've ever had any type of issues when it comes to family, or ever had any type of family dysfunction or dysfunction of any type in a relationship, Jacob's your guy. You're going to find some encouragement in Jacob's story. If you've been around here for very long at all, you've probably heard me share this story before of how Holly and I first met, or at least how I should say the turning point of when I found enough courage to actually ask Holly out on a date. I was in Bible college, and I remember looking out my dorm room window, and Holly, my wife Holly, she was always, in fact, give a wave, Holly, back there. So I always knew she was way above my pay grade. And so I was like, man, there's no way if I asked her to go on a date with me, she would ever say yes. And so I, for the longest time, that was the reason I never asked her. Until one day I was looking out my dorm room window, and I see her walking hand in hand with this guy who I was in class with. And this guy, he was a nice guy. He was so sweet, really just the nicest guy in the world, but he wasn't the sharpest tool in the tool shed. He was not a bright guy at all. And I don't know what it was, but watching those two walk hand in hand, something triggered in my mind, like if he could get that girl, I've got a chance. I've got a chance. If that guy can get a Holly, I've got a chance at this. And really, Jacob's story is kind of like that. Especially, again, if you've ever had any kind of dysfunction or had any kind of issues as it relates to family or marriage or, friendship, whatever the case is, you're going to find some encouragement in looking at Jacob's story, because Jacob's story is a story, when you look at the dysfunction in his life that he grew up in and he had to work through and how God still managed to use him, he's an ultimate story of, hey, if Jacob could make it through and God could use him and God could restore and bring healing to his family, listen, you got a chance. I don't care what dysfunction you bring in here. I don't care what issues you got. Listen, you've got some hope. Jacob's story gives us hope for our family, hope for restoration, hope for forgiveness, hope for healing. It gives us a chance. Yes, you have a chance. You've got a chance. And so we're going to kind of jump into Jacob's story. But before we get into the text, I want to give you a little context of Jacob's upbringing and just kind of how we get to where we get to Jacob in Genesis 35. So Jacob was one of twin boys, and his father was Isaac. In fact, we talked about Isaac last week, and of course, in Isaac's defense, before we start kind of unpacking maybe not the best fathering practices by Isaac, in Isaac's defense, if you were here last week, I don't know, growing up where your dad is holding a knife over you, for whatever reason, I'm sure there was going to be some psychological trauma on Isaac's life. Good reasons or bad. Isaac definitely would have walked away from that experience, I think, with some family issues and family dynamic issues of his own. But Isaac is the father. He fathers these two twin boys, and these twin boys' names are Esau and Jacob. And Esau is the oldest. Esau comes out, just moments before Jacob. And so Esau comes out, and he comes out with just like a full-on beard. I mean, he's a born lumberjack. In fact, he had so much hair. I mean, this is like Chewbacca coming out of the womb, that they call him, literally, that's what Esau means, hairy. He was hairy, which, props to Isaac for creativity in naming his boy. Yeah, needless to say, Isaac will not be writing a book of child names, as suggestions. But he names Esau hairy. But as Esau's coming out, he notices this hand that's gripping the heel of Esau, and literally pretty much just right on his heel. So as they're pulling, Esau out of the womb, there's Jacob right there grabbing the heel, and comes out, and you can just imagine just the gears turning in Isaac's head, like, what am I going to name this boy? And so he names him Isaac, which means heel grabber. Again, super creative, right? Oh, Jacob. Yes, sorry. No, thank you. Yeah. So, yeah. Actually, probably would have been better off naming him Isaac, but yes, he named him Jacob. So we've got Harry here, and then we've got heel grabber over here. These are the two boys. And again, for Jacob, here's the challenge, is that his father definitely had his preferences. His father was not shy about showing favoritism, as Isaac definitely had a favorite out of these two, and that was Esau, for a couple reasons. One, Esau was the firstborn, and so as the firstborn, you typically, you got the fair share of the inheritance. You were the one that got the brand new car when you turned 16. I mean, you were you were the blessed one. You were the favored one as being first. But even more than that, though, Esau he just had this obsession, or it said, Isaac had this obsession with Esau and just as his son. Now Jacob, on the other hand, was kind of seen in Isaac's eyes almost kind of a little bit of a second class. He looked down on Jacob a lot. And again, it could have just been because Esau was firstborn, but I think more than that, though, is that, Esau kind of fit this ideal, I think, for Isaac. Like in Esau, he saw this Chewbacca of a kid coming out. He was a hunter. He was sort of the quote-unquote man's man. He was Cabela through and through. He would drink elk urine at dinner. He was Isaac's kind of dream kid. Like if he could form the ultimate boy-to-man story, this was Esau. Now, Jacob, on the other hand, Jacob was more of a mama's boy. Jacob was the kid who was surfing online at Nordstrom.com. He's going through his process, and he's checking out stuff. He's going on Pinterest and trying to pin the best soup recipes. And so this is, that's Jacob, and so they're growing up in this dynamic here. So Jacob's growing up with this dynamic of constantly being looked down on, but not just that, regularly being put down. Because again, remember his name. His name was Jacob, which didn't just mean heel grabber. His name literally meant manipulator, liar, because again, his father saw in Jacob someone trying to steal his older brother's birthright. So imagine every time the dinner table, they're called to come down for dinner and hang out, they would say, hey, Esau and Isaac and Jacob, Esau and Jacob. And every time they would say Jacob, basically it was just in there saying, hey, you loser. Hey, you failure. Hey, you second class of a son. You come here, you come hang out there every single day. Think about that. He was being reminded of how he wasn't as good as Esau. How he was not as great as Esau. He was not as skilled as Esau. And so this is his life. This is his upbringing. This is what he's growing up into. And listen, part of the reason I share that, because I think I think most especially if you're a parent in here, I think would agree is that you ever realize that people will always rise or fall to the levels of your expectations of them? People will always rise or fall to the level of your expectations of them. And when you set expectations that this is what you are, ultimately they're going to come to believe that. And that's what it was for Jacob. Jacob ultimately came to believe that that's just who he is. I'm a liar. I'm a cheater. I'm a manipulator. And before long, he was actually not just believing that, but acting out those beliefs as he would go on to steal his brother's birthrights and this kind of coup he worked out with his mom. And then we just kind of, from there, he would just spend this sort of life on the run, going from one broken, dysfunctional relationship after the next. And in fact, it would be a short time after that, we'd see him kind of run into sort of the love of his life. Much like I saw Holly out of the dorm room window, he saw this girl by the name of Rachel at a distance and fell in love instantly. And so he goes to Rachel's father and wants to ask her father, Laban, for her hand in marriage. And of course, Laban responds to Jacob, much like any father of a daughter would probably respond to a kid's request like that, as he goes, hey, well, do you got a job, basically? Like, are you working? Do you got a job? How are you going to provide? And Jacob's like, I got none of that stuff. So he's like, well, how about this? Why don't you come work for me for 7 years, and then you can have my daughter, Rachel. And so he works 7 years. He's doing a great job. It comes to wedding night, and, I don't know, it's almost like an episode of Jerry Springer, but like if the party was just going a little bit too wild and crazy. We don't know if Jacob had a little too much to drink, but whatever the case was, Jacob woke up the next morning and he came to find himself married not to Rachel, but to her older sister Leah. Again, Jerry. I mean, this is like a total Jerry Springer episode right here. And in fact, actually, in a couple of weeks, we're actually going to revisit this part of the story. And there's a lot of depth here. There's a lot of kind of wild, crazy, but some really cool truth found within that story. But anyway, he would go on to work another 7 years, and eventually he would get Rachel. So here he's got Rachel and he's got Leah, and the same favoritism. It's interesting. The same favoritism that was kind of tortured him so much of his life. He would go on to kind of show in reference to Rachel as opposed to Leah. And so as a result, it's just kind of one story over the next kind of span of 10 chapters. You literally just read of Jacob going from one dysfunctional, broken, wounded relationship after the next. And here's why I share all that to you. Is because here's the thing about what these broken relationships and kind of his story begins to really show us is that when you get down to it, is what is not healed is always handed down. If what is not healed in our lives, healed in our relationships, if we don't find healing for that stuff, it's always handed down. It's always passed down. What isn't healed is handed down. Listen, even the stuff you hate. How many times have you said in your life, man, I hate what maybe my father said about me, or I hate what my uncle, or I hate what this person did to me, or it's said about me. And yet, isn't it amazing how often we'll go on to do the exact same things with our kids? We'll say the same things. We'll treat them the same way. Because here's the thing. You don't break the cycle because you hate it. You break the cycle of handing it down because God heals it. Did you get that? When you look at, if you're in a situation where you find just dysfunction after dysfunction, issue after issue in your family or in your marriage or in your relationship, listen, you don't break the cycle because you hate it. You break the cycle of handing it down because God heals it. God heals it, which is what starts to bring us to this place of what it is to fix the foundation. See, this is where the turning point in Jacob's story really starts to happen. The turning point in his life, the turning point in his family, the turning point in his marriage and relationships. And we see it in Genesis chapter 35, verse 1. It says, "And God said to Jacob, go up to Bethel." Now Bethel literally means house of God. This is where the presence of God. This was not a foreign place to Jacob. This was actually the place that years earlier God had first showed up and met Jacob in a powerful way. And he says, go up to Bethel, and there's a couple of phrases here that I love. It says, and settle there and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. So again, those key phrases there, settle there and build an altar there to God. See, this story, this wasn't just about Jacob running from someone, not just running from past relationship issues, issues with his dad, issues with his family. This was more than that. Jacob was also running after something. In fact, we don't have time to kind of cover it, but verse after verse, we just see in those kind of 10 chapters from 25 to 35, it's just, Jacob kind of hopping from one relationship to the next, hopping from one place to the next, hopping from one job to the next. It's just this continual, constant, on the move. He's like a walking, breathing U2 song, still hasn't found what he's looking for, right? See, because for Jacob, his whole life, he was, it wasn't just running from someone, but he was looking for something as well. He was wanting to somehow, maybe if I get enough stuff, or I achieve enough success, or I do enough things, that maybe, just maybe, my father will see me differently. Maybe, just maybe, I could go back home and my dad wouldn't see me as a second-class son. My dad wouldn't see me as simply a liar or a cheater, but he'd see someone successful, someone who's made it, someone who's arrived, someone who's done something. And so Jacob, he lives his whole life not just running from someone, but running for something, constantly trying to chase a fulfillment and a satisfaction in stuff and things and achievement and success. In fact, that's why I love that term where it says, where God invites him to Bethel and says, settle there. Because all of Jacob's life had been living in tents. And tents back then, you got to understand, that was like the equivalent of like our modern RV. Now we don't know how big his tent was, if it was a 15-footer, 20-footer, if it had a pull-out. We don't know that. But we do know this was a guy who was constantly on the move. And every place he went, every new relationship, every new achievement still was leaving this emptiness and this void in his life. Interesting thing about tents is that tents were back then, they were always made of skin, and that was symbolic of actually humanity. In Hebrew culture, symbolic of humanity. It represents our flesh, our humanity, our human condition. And so here's God calling him. Sit there and say, hey, listen, Jacob, you want to experience some change in your family? You want to start to experience some change in your life? You want to start to find some real fulfillment, some real satisfaction? It's time to sell the tents. It's time to retire the tents. It's time to settle here in my presence. It's time to settle here in a relationship with me. And then he calls him to do something else. He calls him to go on to rebuild the altar. Now, what's the altar? The altar is the place of a restored relationship with God. The altar was the place, Old Testament knew that was the place where a relationship was restored. A relationship with God was made right again. And so in calling him to this, he said, listen, Jacob, you got to understand the fulfillment, the healing, the restoration you're desiring. It doesn't come from buying tents. It comes from building altars. And this is a key, especially if, like Jacob, you'd sit there and look at your situation with a family or a marriage or any kind of relationship, and you see issues and you see dysfunction. Listen, you got to understand, if you want to break that cycle, if you want to see something different, the dysfunction in your family can only end at the altar. It can only end when you actually take the time to fix the foundation. You step into a restored, a renewed, a right relationship with God. That's what's going on here. Listen, and this is the turning point. This is where it all begins to change for him. This restored relationship with God, this restored relationship with Jesus. Not just chasing after the approval of others, but instead seeking to finding his true identity in the approval and acceptance of our God. See, this is where things start to begin to change for him and his life and his family. And we see this in verse 9. It says, after Jacob returned from Padan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be Jacob. Your name will be Israel. So he named him Israel. See, only in the acceptance and the approval of our God is it that he found his true identity. And an identity not defined by others, not defined by his dad, not defined by his past, not defined by his failures, not defined by his mistakes, but defined by our God and his grace and his love and his mercy for you and for me. And it's there he started to find healing. It's there he started to find restoration. It's there he started to see his family and see his life totally different. And here's why this matters. And you start to move to kind of practical terms here is because so often when we look at the issues and the dysfunction when it comes to our families or it comes to our relationships, it's so easy to just sit there and say, God, you really need to work on my husband. Preacher, you need to get on my husband and tell them how he needs to cherish me more, he needs to honor me more. Or sit there and think, my spouse really needs Jesus. They really need Jesus. Or my kids, they're crazy. Preacher, can't you talk about, how you need to submit and honor your mother and father more? God, you really need to do a work on my family. But here's what this story reminds us is that, listen, when God works, or I should say this, put it this way, the work God wants to do in your family, you got to understand it always begins in you. The work God wants to do in your family, it always begins in you. It started in Jacob. It started with him fixing the foundation, restoring this relationship with Jesus, encountering God's grace, encountering God's